watched a couple videos. I'm doing this while I'm driving because if I don't do it, I'm going to lose. I'll probably forget later, or I'll lose my track of thought here just by being distracted with dealing with people. But been watching a couple of videos. A couple of science videos came up, quantum physics and string theory and all that good stuff, boring stuff. But it all wound up bringing up a couple videos of the argument over the number of infinity. And can the number exist? Well, first of all, we know that when it comes to getting small, there is a finite definition. We might not be able to understand that number, but there is a finite definition to how small something can become. Because once it hits that finite, it explodes. Big Bang Theory. Big Bang Theory, if correct, proves that you can't get infinitely small. You hit a finite number and it explodes. That's Big Bang Theory. Astrophysics proves that everything has a finite number to how big it gets, because once it finally gets to a certain size, it collapses in on itself. So there's a finite number, no matter how big that number is and how endless that number appears, there is a finite number to how large something can finally get before it collapses in on itself. In nature, infinity only applies to one reality. In all of existence, it still only applies to one reality. That is free will. There's a religious argument. People like to argue that, well, God demands this and and God rules over all. That still does not eliminate free will. If it did, you wouldn't be punished for sin, because all your sins are committed because God wanted you to commit those sins. So free will exists. Law and order. Every single human being on the planet will admit that people need to be punished for when they do wrong. Now, granted, you have extremes to what people think are wrongs or not wrong. But still, it comes down to the very simple fact that every single human being on the planet admits that people need to be punished for what they perceive as being wrong. If they did not believe in free will, no matter what they argue, they can argue all day long that they do not believe in free will. But because they believe in punishment, they obviously believe in free will. Whether they want to admit it or not, they believe in free will. Because only a person who absolutely does not believe in free will would not believe that there is any wrong. Because an individual cannot do wrong in the eyes of an individual that believes absolutely that there is no free will. That means that individual that absolutely believes that there is no free will not want a person punished for killing his or her mother. They will not want a person punished for killing his or her father. They will not want a person punished for killing any family member. They will not want a person punished for raping his or her daughter. Or his or her son. There is no human being on the planet that does not believe in free will. And the reality is, it's because free will exists. There is no argument against free will that makes any sense. The only argument that makes sense is for free will. It's the only argument that makes sense. And even mathematicians, they can try to come up with a mathematical number to prove that free will doesn't exist. But the problem is, computers prove free will exists. Even if you only gave a computer two choices as an outcome, the computer won't always make the same choice to that outcome. That proves there's free will. Even a computer verifies it. But let's say you give the computer two scenarios that happen, and then you give it access to the internet to come up with a decision of how to react to those two scenarios. The computer, by accessing the internet, will come up with multiple outcomes. To make it even more interesting, tell the computer it can only come up with one outcome and program 100 computers the same exact way. Those computers, you might find a couple computers will come up with the same outcome, but even if the majority of the computers come up with the same outcome, there will be computers that will come up with a different outcome. And the more scenarios that you put leading up to the point where the computer gets to make a choice, there will be more and more discrepancies in them outcomes that the computer chooses as the decision by accessing the internet. There is no logical argument against free will. And the irony is, mathematics proves free will. The only reason mathematics proves free will is because you can come up with this number of infinite. And that number infinite can only be applied to free will argumentally. It's only free will that number can be applied to. But because it can be applied to free will, that is the proof of free will. There is no logical argument against free will. Every argument you can try to come up with against free will, there is a logical argument against it. But every argument that you try to come up with against free will, there comes a point in time where you can no longer keep arguing the argument for free will. there will come a point where you hit that wall. There will be a wall arguing against free will. Like I said, even using God, you can't argue against free will. Sin, the punishment of sin, is proof of free will. God would not punish you for sin if you did not have free will, because your sin would be his choice or her choice, depending on your view of God. Free will is the only absolute, other than if you believe in God. If you believe in God, then there's two absolutes: God and free will. If you don't believe in God, free will is the only absolute. It's a very simple argument. But I just watched a couple lectures, and I'm actually going to post this video in the comments of those two lectures, of those two panel lectures, because it's the only argument, the only absolute. If you don't believe in God, the only absolute is free will. It is the only absolute. There is no other absolute. It is the only absolute, and it is the only absolute that affinity would actually apply to. Now, numbers can get so large that we can't even comprehend them, and so on a comprehensive scale, yes, they're infinitive, but it does not mean that they are actually infinitive. They do have an end. At some point in time, they have an end. Only free will is infinite. Now, a mathematician would try to argue, well, you can only have so many human beings on the planet. So, because there's only so many human beings that can be on the planet, and even though the number seems infinite of how many choices a human being can make, and each of those choices influences the choices of the next human being, still, theoretically, you hit an infinite number. We're getting ready to colonize Mars. We might colonize the moon. Once we start colonizing other bodies, it throws that equation out the window. Because now, even though they might not, and even then, there's still choices that people might be making on the planet, on the moon and Mars, that could influence us. And they will influence our choices. Infinity proves free will. And infinity only applies to free will. Because free will is the only thing with an infinite option of choices.